He was feared throughout the north of Nigeria. Young, strong, and driven by a fanaticism he believed was faith, Idris Lawal led attacks against Christians, burned churches, and carried the name of God on the weapons he wielded. But one silent night, when darkness seemed to swallow the last burning temple, something impossible happened. The one Idris had sworn to destroy spoke to him, a voice that tore through hatred, froze the fire, and brought him to his knees. From that encounter on, the warrior became the most wanted man, not for revenge, but for the grace that transformed him. Today you are going to discover what really happened that night, and how the voice of Jesus forever changed the destiny of a terrorist. And to begin, make sure you are already subscribed, like the video, and tell me where you are watching from, because this story will move you deeply.
I grew up believing I knew the truth. My name is Idris Lawal, and I was born in a dry and forgotten village in northern Nigeria, where the wind carried more dust than hope. My father was a man feared and respected, a master of the Quran, a guide for the faithful, a man whose word was law. Since I was little, he taught me that the world was divided between the pure and the impure, between those who followed the will of Allah and those who corrupted it. And among those corrupt ones, he said, were the Christians. In that village, being Muslim was not just a belief. It was identity itself. Everything revolved around prayers, the repetition of sacred verses, and the fear of making mistakes. I remember nights when the sky looked like a black curtain over our heads and my father would wake me before sunrise to repeat the words of the Quran until my throat hurt. I admired him. I wanted to be like him. He said that hatred toward the infidels was an act of loyalty, that fighting for faith was a sacred duty. I was only 8 years old, but those words were carved into my heart like fire on stone. I never forgot the day a Christian merchant offered my father a cup of water. It was hot, and the sun burned so intensely that the ground seemed to breathe. My father looked at the cup, looked at the man, and said in a cold voice, "The water of infidels is impure." He poured the liquid into the dust, and I watched that water disappear, mixing with the dry earth. In that instant, something inside me believed that the man standing before us was the enemy. And if my father said it was a sin to accept something from a Christian, I believed it without question. With time, that curious boy became a teenager with a heart full of anger. I saw the injustices, the poverty, the hunger that plagued our people. I saw the promises of a distant government that never looked north. And in the voices of men who came down from the mountains preaching holy war, I began to see a purpose. They spoke of courage, of honor, of rewards in paradise. They said those who died fighting for faith would be received by angels, covered in eternal glory. I listened to all that and felt something awaken inside me, a flame that seemed like justice, but was hatred in disguise. At 20 years old, I left. I left my father's house and walked for days until I reached a hidden camp near the border with Niger. There, men with hardened eyes and calloused hands welcomed me as a brother. I thought I had finally found my place. I received a new name, a new purpose, a new identity. I spent months in training, learning to shoot, to build explosives, to follow orders without question. Faith blended with the sound of weapons. And every time I doubted, someone would say, "You are fighting for the Creator." But something inside me, perhaps a spark of humanity, still resisted. I tried to silence that voice, telling myself it was weakness, that compassion was a sign of disobedience. And yet, on silent nights, I found myself remembering the look of that Christian merchant, the cup of water falling into the dust. It was a memory that haunted me, as if trying to tell me I was wrong. My first mission came quickly. The air was heavy and the sun rose red on the horizon when we left for a small Christian village. The commander said it would be easy, just clear the ground. I didn't understand what that meant until I heard the first shot. There were women running, children screaming, men trying to protect their homes with their bare hands. An old pastor came out of the church, raising a Bible above his head and saying calmly, "We are peaceful. We don't want war." And then right in front of me, the commander fired. The body of that man fell slowly, and the sound that followed was not the shot. It was silence. A heavy silence that seemed to fill the air. I tried to breathe, but the air burned. My hands trembled. I looked at the ground and saw the Bible stained with dust and blood. For a moment I thought about kneeling down to pick it up. but the commander's look froze me. He said, "Do not hesitate, or you will be next." That night I did not sleep. I washed my weapon in the river and saw my reflection in the water. The eyes staring back at me were not mine. They looked like those of a stranger. I felt fear, not of the enemy, but of myself. I had crossed an invisible line, and nothing would ever be the same. Even so, I continued. For 2 years I became the man my father wanted me to be. A warrior, an executor of faith. I burned churches, destroyed families, believing I was a divine instrument. But with each attack, I felt emptier. I began to realize that the more I fought, the further I felt from God. In one of the villages we attacked, I found a girl hiding behind a wall. She must have been about 10 years old. I aimed at her and she did not move. She just looked at me with a calmness that unsettled me. And before I could say anything, she asked, "Why are you angry?" That question pierced through me like a blade. I stood still, unable to answer. She was not afraid, and that destroyed me inside. The fire that once drove me began to fade. In the months that followed, that childlike voice echoed within me. Why was I angry? Why? I told myself it was for faith, for justice, for honor. But the more I repeated those words, the less sense they made. And then came the night that changed everything. It was November of 2024. The air was hot, and the wind carried the smell of gasoline and dust. I was leading a group of armed men to destroy yet another church near the city of Kano. It was another mission, another flame I would light, another victory against the enemies. I was calm, cool, prepared. At least that's what I told myself. As we approached the temple, something began to feel wrong. The sounds of the desert fell silent. No animals, no insects, no movement. Only the sound of my breathing and the beating of my heart. I felt the weight of the air shift, as if the world were holding its breath. I asked the men to surround the place. I took a match from my pocket and prepared to light it. But the match wouldn't light. 1, 2, 3 times, nothing. I thought it was the wind, but the air was still. Suddenly I felt a presence, and when I looked up, I saw something that none of the others had seen. 12 figures surrounded the church. White robes, faces that shone like fire without burning. They didn't speak, but I felt the sound of something greater than fear. My companions looked at me confused, not understanding why I had stopped. They didn't see what I saw. The match fell from my hand, and the flame I wanted to light was extinguished forever. Suddenly the silence was broken by a voice, not from heaven, nor from earth, but from within my chest, a voice that seemed to pierce through time and touch what remained of my soul. "Idris Lawal, why are you stalking me?" My whole body trembled. I felt the ground disappear. Tears came without warning. I tried to speak, but the only sound that came out was a muffled scream. I fell to my knees. The whole world seemed to spin, and around me, figures of light drew closer. Every memory I had buried, the faces, the screams, the blood, surfaced all at once. I saw each one before me, as if time had turned back to judge me. That elderly pastor, the girl who asked why I was angry. Every church I destroyed, every life I extinguished, was there before me. And the voice continued, "I called you, and yet you still haunt me." The pain was unbearable. It was as if the entire weight of my sin had fallen upon me all at once. But along with the pain, there was something I didn't understand, a feeling of warmth, of compassion, of love. That word I had never truly felt before. The figures surrounded the church, and the fire I had brought did not ignite. The sky seemed to breathe light. I closed my eyes and felt something enveloping me. Not the wind, but a living presence. I heard it again, now more softly. "Idris, I chose you." And there, in the middle of the desert, with my hands stained with guilt and my knees pressed to the ground, I collapsed. For the first time since childhood, I cried uncontrollably. I, the warrior of fire, fell before a voice I could not see, but which was more real than anything I had ever touched. I didn't know what was happening at that moment, but one thing was certain: nothing would ever be the same again. And so it was, that the man who burned churches heard the voice of the one who created him. When I opened my eyes, the first thing I felt was the metallic taste of blood in my mouth and the weight of hands dragging me across the hot sand. My companions were shouting, asking what had happened, why I had fallen, why the fire hadn't lit. I had no answers. The world was spinning and the sounds around me seemed distant, as if I were underwater. All I saw were flashes of what I had just witnessed, the figures of light, the voice that called my name, and that instant when time seemed to stop. They said I'd fainted from the heat, but I knew that wasn't it. Something inside me had broken, or perhaps it had finally been opened. I felt different, as if I'd left something behind that night. The hatred, the purpose, maybe even my own heart. In the following days, I tried to act as if nothing had happened, but I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the 12 white figures again, and in the middle of them, a man with a serene face with wounds on his hands and feet, who looked at me silently. He said nothing. He just stared at me until, at a certain point in the dream, he uttered a single word. He comes. I would wake up sweating, my chest racing, and I felt a presence that wasn't fear, but something new, something I couldn't name. It wasn't guilt, although I had many reasons to feel it. It was something deeper, as if someone were calling me back home. A home I had never known. I tried to resist. I forced myself to repeat the prayers I learned in childhood, to remember the verses my father used to say when I was a boy. But the more I repeated them, the more distant they sounded. That inner voice wouldn't leave me in peace. On the third night after the attack, I dreamed again of the same man. He was standing, surrounded by a golden light that didn't hurt my eyes. I couldn't see his face clearly, but I felt love emanating from him like the warmth of a fire that doesn't burn. He looked at me and for the first time smiled. He said again, "He comes." And when I tried to ask who he was, the answer came without words, as if I had always known. The next morning, I woke up determined. I couldn't stay there any longer. My companions were starting to get suspicious. I was too quiet, too distracted. One of them asked me, "Are you afraid, Idris?" I replied, "No, I'm tired." And it was true. I was tired of killing, of running away, of believing that the pain of others pleased God. The opportunity came weeks later, during a mission at the market. The group had split up, and for a moment I was alone among the stalls. I felt the call again. The noise of voices, the smell of spices, the warmth of the sun, everything disappeared. I heard it inside me for the third time. Now, without looking back, I started walking. I walked for hours, perhaps days. The roads were long. The desert seemed endless. The sand burned my feet. Thirst cut my throat and hunger made my body tremble. But something was guiding me. I didn't know my destination, but I knew I needed to keep going. At night, I slept under the starry sky and dreamed of the same image, a church with a blue door. Every time he woke up, he felt he was closer to her. When I finally arrived in a small town, people looked at me with suspicion. I was wearing dirty clothes. My face was sunburnt, and my body seemed haunted by ghosts. I walked through the streets until, on a narrow corner, I saw something that made me stop. A blue door, just like in the dream. My knees went weak. It was simple, made of worn wood, but it seemed alive. Each step I took toward that door felt like a step out of hell. I touched the doorknob with trembling hands and knocked. A white-haired woman opened the door. She looked at me with astonishment, perhaps fear, but something in her eyes softened. She didn't ask who I was. She simply said in a calm voice, "Are you looking for someone?" For a moment I couldn't answer. I felt a lump in my throat and just murmured, "I think Jesus is looking for me." She was silent for a few seconds, then smiled. "Then you've come to the right place." The woman led me inside. The air in the church was fresh, and a faint smell of wood and burnt oil filled the space. I looked at the floor, ashamed, too afraid to lift my face before the altar. For the first time, I felt the weight of who I was, not as a warrior, but as a sinner. She offered me water, and unlike my father, I accepted. When the liquid touched my mouth, I cried. It was just water, but it felt like healing. That's where I met him, Pastor Emmanuel Okoro. He was a man with a firm voice and a compassionate gaze. When he saw me, he didn't recoil or judge me. I asked to speak with him, and he led me to a small wooden bench beside the altar. I told him everything, every detail, the villages, the burned churches, the elderly pastor, the girl who asked why I was angry. Every sin my mind had tried to hide. The pastor didn't interrupt me. He remained silent with his hands clasped, listening to everything. When I finished, I looked at him expecting condemnation. But he was crying, and he only said, "Jesus already knew everything, and yet he still called you." Those words struck me deeply. The man who believed himself to be an enemy of Christ was being invited by him. I felt the weight of forgiveness even before I understood what forgiveness was. That was the first miracle. Not a light in the sky, nor an extraordinary vision, but the miracle of being accepted when all I deserved was rejection. The following days were filled with silence and tears. The elderly woman, whose name I later learned was Sarah, brought me food, and the pastor began to teach me about the gospel. I listened attentively, but my mind was still confused. How could someone like me be loved? How could God himself want anything to do with me? Each verse felt like a wound being washed. "For God so loved the world" was the first one I managed to memorize. I repeated those words so many times that I began to feel something stirring inside me. For weeks, I stayed hidden in the church. Each day I read more, asked more questions, sought to understand what this presence I felt was. And the more I learned, the more I realized that the love that called to me was not the love that demands, but the love that transforms. But the world outside the church walls doesn't forgive so easily. The news began to spread. A former combatant, a man who once burned churches, was now living among Christians. And when these words reached the ears of my former comrades, the hunt began. They called me a traitor. They said I had abandoned the faith, that I deserved to be wiped off the face of the earth. I knew there was a bounty on my head. Every step I took outside the church was a risk. I couldn't use my name nor show my face, but the real battle wasn't against them. It was within myself. The nights were long. I dreamed of the victims, saw their faces, heard their screams. I woke up sweating, begging God to let me forget. But he wouldn't. And I understood why. He didn't want me to forget. He wanted me to understood. One day, Pastor Emmanuel told me, "Idris, rejecting forgiveness is the same as saying that the blood of Christ is not enough." Those words set me free. I realized that as long as I refused to accept forgiveness, I would remain trapped in the past. And if Jesus had called me, it was because he saw something in me that I didn't see in myself. That's when I decided to get baptized. On the morning of the baptism, the sun streamed through the stained glass windows of the church, painting the floor blue and gold. There were few people. Everyone knew they were risking their lives by being there. But no one seemed afraid. The pastor called me, and when I entered the water, I felt as if the weight of years had dissolved. As the water streamed down my face, an elderly lady, whom I didn't know, came up to me. She hugged me and said in a trembling voice, "My son died in an attack like yours, but today I see that God is giving me back a son." I cried like a child. That hug was living proof that God can transform even the deepest hatred into forgiveness. From that day on, I began to see the world with different eyes. The Bible ceased to be just words and became life. Forgiveness ceased to be a concept and became breath. But even amidst this peace, something inside me knew. The biggest test was yet to come. Because sometimes God restores us, and then calls us to prove how real that restoration is. And that's exactly what happened to me. For months, there was an uneasy silence, the kind that seems to hide something about to happen. I had already learned to live in constant alert. Every noise outside the house where I was hiding made my heart race. The persecution hadn't stopped. Those who had once fought by my side now wanted me dead. Yet inside me there was a peace I couldn't explain. It was a different kind of peace, one that didn't depend on what was happening around me. I spent my days reading, praying, and helping Pastor Emmanuel with small church tasks. Sometimes I would spend hours just sitting, looking at the blue door and remembering the night it all began. But that morning, something changed. I remember the faint sound of footsteps approaching the house. It was early, the sun had barely risen, and a cold wind blew in through the cracks in the window. The pastor had gone out to visit another community, and I was alone. When there was a knock at the door, my first impulse was fear. No one knew I lived there, and the last time someone came unannounced, we had to flee in haste. I stood there, breathless, while the knocking repeated itself, 1, 2, 3 times. I opened the door slowly, ready to run if necessary. On the other side was a woman. She looked tired, her eyes sunken, her face marked by stories I didn't yet know. She held a small bag, and in a firm voice asked, "Are you Idris Lawal?" My body froze. That question was too dangerous. I took a deep breath and responded only with a nod. She stared at me with an uncanny calm, and before I could say anything, she said something that made the ground disappear beneath my feet. That name struck me like a bolt of lightning. I knew it. I had heard it before, shouted actually, amidst the chaos of an attack some years ago. Miriam was the name of a pastor's wife who had died during one of my missions, a man who tried to protect his church and ended up falling before my eyes. I felt the air disappear. Her words faded into a distant hum. I could only think of one thing. I was standing before the widow of a man I had helped to kill. She continued, "I was told that you converted a few months ago, that you now speak about the love of Jesus. I needed to see for myself if that was true." I couldn't answer. Shame paralyzed me. The past I had been trying to leave behind was now standing before me, with a face, a voice, and tears. I remained silent for what seemed like an eternity. The memory of that attack returned with full force. The fire consuming the church roof, the screams, the smoke, the sound of gunfire. And in the midst of it all, the face of Pastor Baco, the man who had tried to speak to me before he fell. I remember his last words. "Even in the fire, forgiveness is still light." My hands began to tremble. I tried to say something, but no words came out, until finally I murmured, almost breathless, "I was there. I saw him die. I hated him for no reason." The silence that followed was unbearable. The woman in front of me closed her eyes and let the tears fall, one by one. Those were minutes of restrained, heavy, deep crying. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to disappear. I wanted the ground to swallow me whole. But after a while, Miriam lifted her face. There was something different in her gaze, a mixture of pain and serenity. She took a deep breath and said something that changed everything. "My husband preached forgiveness until his last day. He said that forgiveness is not an easy choice. It's a cross to bear. If Jesus forgave you, who am I not to try?" Those words broke me. I, who had so often seen people begging for mercy, had never imagined that someone could offer me that. I cried. I couldn't hold back. I cried in a way I had never cried before, not out of fear, but out of true regret. Miriam approached slowly and placed her hand on my shoulder. She said, her voice trembling, "I still don't know how to deal with all of this. But I know that the same God who sustained me when I lost my husband is the same one who brought you here." It was at that moment that I understood what grace is. It's not a nice idea, nor is it a prize for those who deserve it. Grace is a help that arrives when you are broken. Grace is the love that chooses to embrace the broken. In the days that followed, Miriam began to visit the church. Sometimes she wouldn't say anything. She would just sit there, looking at the altar where her husband used to preach. I avoided meeting her gaze, not out of lack of courage, but out of respect. I felt that God was stitching up an old wound, and I was merely the instrument he had chosen for it. One morning, she brought me a Bible. She said it was her husband's. The cover was worn, the edges yellowed, and there were notes in the margins. She handed it to me and said, "He would have wanted you to have her." I held that book as one holds a beating heart. On the first page, there was an underlined sentence, "Where sin abounded, grace abounded all the more." It was there that I truly understood what Jesus had done for me. From that day on, I began to feel something new. A deep desire to serve, to repair, to give back to the world some of the peace that I had stolen. Time passed. With the help of pastors and missionaries, I began to travel discreetly. taking messages to small groups of young Muslims who were being drawn in by the same lies that had once seduced me. I would tell my story, look them in the eye and say, the same hands that burned churches are now raising Bibles. At first, many didn't believe, but from time to time I saw tears streaming down faces that feigned indifference. I knew God was at work. I'm still on the move. I don't stay in one place for long. Secret churches shelter me. Brothers help me cross regions where the gospel is still persecuted. Every night when I close my eyes, I pray, asking God to keep me faithful, even if the price is high. I've received threats. I've had to flee in the middle of the night. But strangely, fear no longer controls me. I know I could die at any moment, but now death is not the end. It's just the beginning. To die for Jesus is to live forever. Sometimes I think of Miriam. She remains steadfast, serving in another community, caring for orphaned children. She wrote me a letter saying that she has learned to forgive, and that forgiveness has freed not only me, but her soul as well. She said that hatred is like a prison without walls, and that forgiveness is the key that lets us out. Your words accompany me on every journey. In every new face I meet, I see a reflection of the mercy that once reached me. When I look at my hands, I still see the scars, the signs of what I was. But now, those same hands that once wielded weapons raise bread and wine in secret meetings of faith. They welcome, heal, and bless. I am no longer the man I once was. Not because I have become good, but because I have been broken and rebuilt. Everything in me is a result of grace. Even living in hiding, I realize that my story is spreading. In every village I pass through, someone stops me. Someone wants to listen. Someone wants to believe that there is hope for them too. And I say, there is. Because if God was able to reach someone like me, a lost, hardened man consumed by hatred, then he can reach anyone. I've seen young people abandon radicalism after listening to me. I've seen parents cry when they realize that forgiveness is stronger than revenge. I've seen the impossible happen, not once but many times. Each new day is a miracle. Each new step is a chance to bear witness. I live in hiding, yes, but the message I carry cannot be hidden. And every time fear tries to return, I remember the voice that called to me that night, surrounded by light. Idris Lawal, why are you stalking me? Today, when I hear that question within me, I answer it in prayer. I no longer pursue you, Lord. Now I follow you. And as long as I have breath, I will continue telling this story. Because if there's one thing I've learned, it's that true forgiveness isn't forgetting, it's transformation. Miriam's forgiveness showed me the face of grace. Jesus' love taught me what freedom is. And with every soul touched by this story, I see fulfilled what Pastor Emmanuel once told me. Jesus doesn't just transform lives, he transforms destinies. But this journey is not yet over. There are still shadows lurking, voices from the past trying to silence me, people who still haven't understood what really happened to me. And that's why I keep talking, even if I have to whisper, because as long as I have a voice, this story will continue to be told.
And so ends the story of Idris Lawal, the man who once believed he was fighting for God, but discovered that in truth, God was always fighting for him. A journey of hatred transformed into love, of destruction converted into living faith. The boy raised in the desert became a messenger of hope, and the same heart that burned churches now ignites the flame of grace wherever it goes. Stories like Idris's remind us that no one is beyond the reach of Jesus, that light can shine even in the darkest places, and that forgiveness is the miracle that changes not only a destiny, but the world around us. If you've made it this far, it's because something inside you has also been touched. So enjoy this moment. Check if you are already subscribed to the channel. Leave your like so that more people can see testimonials like this. Write the phrase in the comments. I love Jesus, so that the whole world knows that you too are part of this current of faith. And get ready, because the next video that's appearing on your screen will leave you speechless. You're about to learn the story of the Nigerian pastor whom Boko Haram failed to kill. A true story of miracle, courage, and divine intervention that will challenge your faith and show you, once again, that the impossible is only the beginning when God decides to act. Click now, because this is one of those stories you have to see to believe.